Resident Evil 5 is one of the most controversial Resident Evil games of all time, but even after years later, there is still so much to learn, from lore facts to hidden secrets and previous game connections. This is everything that you may have not known about Resident Evil 5. It was the first Resident Evil game to have the English F-bomb in it. Previous games had curse words in them, but Resident Evil 5 was the very first Resident Evil game to have the F-bomb in it, at least in English. It was the first ever Resident Evil game to have subtitles during cutscenes. Previous games either had no subtitles or they had minimal subtitles. In Resident Evil 5, we see the Type 2 version of the Las Plagas. Back in Resident Evil 4, we saw Type 1. Type 1 of Las Plagas needed to be inhaled or injected. Type 1 also hated sunlight, and it took longer for the host to be controlled. But Resident Evil 5 has Type 2 Plagas. Type 2 is resistant to sunlight, and it takes less time to control the host. We see this in the intro sequence of Resident Evil 5. Out of all of Umbrella's BOWs, the Licker is the only one to make an appearance. Resident Evil 5 was originally going to have regular zombies, but of course that was scrapped in the final version. This is the only Resident Evil game before the year 2015 where a Resident Evil history fact is shown while loading up the next scene. As you're playing Resident Evil 5, and when you go into the next big scene, the game will show you a history fact from the Resident Evil franchise. This was the first ever Resident Evil game to do this. Sheva's shoulder tattoo means hero in Swahili. In Resident Evil 5's Mercenaries mode, Albert Wesker can perform an attack called the Tiger Uppercut. The Tiger Uppercut is a reference to a special move from Street Fighter, and Street Fighter is another popular franchise from Capcom. RE5 was originally going to have a desert level with a wrecked ship. This was later scrapped from the final game due to the level being too tedious to roam around. Since there were going to be no buildings in this level, it would have featured sand zombies rising from the sand. When you play co-op as Sheva, notice how you are always on the right side of the screen, and when you play as Chris, he is always on the left side of the screen. This is because Sheva is actually left-handed and Chris is right-handed. RE5 was originally supposed to have a merchant in the game, much like the one from Resident Evil 4. This merchant was rumored to be the same guy who gave Chris and Sheva their weapons at the beginning of the game. This was, however, scrapped from the final game. Jill Valentine's likeness was taken from a character known as Fiona Belly from another Capcom game known as Haunting Ground. Notice how they both look extremely similar. Gotta love Capcom and their game connections. The actress who plays as Sheva in Resident Evil 5 once acted in a short film called Evil Resident. Even though this short film was unrelated to the Resident Evil series, years later she was hired by Capcom to act as Sheva. This was the first main entry without Shinji Mikami. Before Resident Evil 5 was released, Shinji Mikami claimed that he wouldn't like RE5 since this was a game that he wasn't working on. When Shinji eventually played RE5, he praised Capcom's hard work. However, he still didn't like the idea of a Resident Evil game that was different from his style. And we can see that. Resident Evil 4 and RE5 are two very different games. This was the first Resident Evil game where we can see the player physically switching their weapons, rather than opening up an inventory screen like previous RE games. RE5 is also the first RE game where the inventory runs in real time and will not pause. So if you open up your inventory, well, you're still not safe. This was the first RE game with Dolby True HD 5.1 surround sound. This is important because you can tell that the audio design is pretty good in Resident Evil 5. RE5 has really good surround sound effects, so it's nice to see that upgrade from Capcom. In Chapter 1-2, you can see posters of an album by Paula Hopkins. The title of these posters says Mother. This same poster can also be seen in another Capcom game known as Dead Rising. Once again, you gotta love these connections. This is the second Resident Evil game game where Jill Valentine was on the side of Albert Wesker, and this is also her first time where she follows his evil ways due to a device with a progenitor chemical. This device was originally supposed to be planted on her head, but of course was later changed. This is the first mainline Resident Evil game where all original main characters make an appearance. Chris, Jill, and Albert. Barry and Rebecca also make an appearance in the minigame known as Mercenary Reunion. Jill Valentine was originally supposed to be imprisoned in a capsule by Tricell, and then later rescued by Chris Redfield. Sheva was supposed to be a non-playable character, and Barry Burton would be a supporting character. This was later changed to Jill being brainwashed, Sheva being Chris's co-op partner, and Barry being pushed to be the protagonist for Resident Evil Revelations 2. Many elements of Resident Evil 5 were inspired from scrapped versions of Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 had many beta builds. For example, the castle in the Lost in Nightmares DLC is somewhat inspired by the idea of Leon exploring a castle in Resident Evil 4. He would roam a ghostly castle, and we see some of those elements in Resident Evil 5's DLC. The black fog that was supposed to originally be in Resident Evil 4 inspired the Ouroboros virus from Resident Evil 5. Chris was also joined by a female partner, Sheva, much like the idea of Leon, who was supposed to be helped by another female character in the Resident Evil 4 beta concepts. It's crazy how a beta can still inspire the later games. Resident Evil 4, such an inspiration. And that was 20 facts that you may have not known about Resident Evil 5. Which fact interested you the most? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.